"Excuse me, but you'll need to move. This seat isn't for you." The words hung in the air of the first-class cabin, cutting through the gentle hum of boarding passengers and clattering overhead compartments. They weren't whispered or disguised as polite suggestion. They were delivered with the casual confidence of someone stating an obvious truth that the black woman in seat 2A simply didn't belong. What began with a humiliating walk to the last row would end with an airline's transformation. A casual act of discrimination would trigger a chain reaction reaching far beyond one flight, one crew, one passenger. The woman in seat 2A didn't raise her voice. She didn't cause a scene. She simply looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. No one watching would have guessed that in exactly 47 minutes, SkyWave Airlines would face its most significant crisis in 20 years of operation. No one could have predicted that this quiet, composed woman would, by the time the plane touched down in Atlanta, fundamentally alter the trajectory of one of America's largest airlines. Because sometimes the person you least expect to have power is precisely the one who has it all. If you've ever witnessed unfair treatment while traveling, comment below. And if you're ready to see what happens when discrimination meets unexpected consequences, hit that subscribe button now. Vivian Blackwell had mastered the art of professional invisibility. At 38, she'd perfected the ability to observe without being observed, to see everything while being seen as nothing special. Today, dressed in dark jeans, a simple navy blouse, and minimal jewelry, she looked like any other traveler, comfortable, practical, unmemorable. Only the worn leather messenger bag slung across her body hinted at something more. Inside it, alongside her personal items, was her federal identification, a specialized tablet with proprietary software and the authority of the entire United States government. As Senior Aviation Safety Inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, Vivian Blackwell wasn't just another passenger. She was the eyes and ears of regulatory oversight, specially trained to evaluate every aspect of airline operations from customer service to critical safety protocols. With 12 years at the agency, she'd become one of their most effective investigators, particularly in her specialty of cabin crew compliance and passenger safety standards. Behind her professional accomplishments lay a deeply personal motivation. 14 years earlier, her younger brother Michael had boarded Flight 2103 to visit her in Atlanta. That plane never arrived. The subsequent investigation revealed a catastrophic chain of events stemming from improperly secured overhead oxygen generators and falsified maintenance logs. The crash killed all 156 people aboard. The official report used clinical language about procedural failures and human factors, but Vivian knew the truth was simpler. People had cut corners and passengers had died because of it. She'd been an engineering student at Howard University then, with plans to design aircraft systems. After the crash, after the funeral, where they'd buried an empty casket after the settlement with its insulting confidentiality clause, Vivian had changed direction. If she couldn't bring Michael back, she could at least ensure other families didn't experience similar preventable losses. Enforcement isn't about punishment, she often told new inspectors she mentored. It's about prevention. Every violation we correct is a potential tragedy averted. Today's assignment came after months of mounting complaints about SkyWave Airlines' allegations of discriminatory treatment, reports of safety shortcuts during their rapid expansion, and concerning patterns in their incident reports. What had finally triggered this unannounced inspection was a pattern of complaints specifically about Flight 327, a route with an unusually high number of passenger removals, all following a suspicious demographic pattern. What she hadn't anticipated was becoming the subject of discrimination herself. But as she settled into seat 2A, Vivian's trained eye was already noting concerning details: the flight attendant who'd checked her boarding pass twice while waving through the white passengers before her, the slightly delayed greeting compared to other first-class passengers, the way her request for water was acknowledged but not fulfilled. Small things. Easily denied things. The kind of subtle discrepancies that passengers felt but struggled to prove. The kind that created hostile environments while maintaining plausible deniability. What SkyWave Airlines didn't realize was that they weren't just treating a passenger poorly. They were providing evidence to the very person assigned to evaluate them. SkyWave Flight 327 operated one of the airline's flagship Boeing 787 Dreamliners, a testament to the carrier's rapid expansion and premium ambitions. The aircraft, less than 3 years old, represented everything the airline wanted to project about itself: modern, efficient, world-class. Its exterior gleamed in SkyWave's distinctive blue and silver livery, while inside the cabin had been designed to emphasize the stark contrast between service classes. First class featured 16 pod-style seats arranged in 4 rows each, a cocoon of beige leather and brushed aluminum. Private dividers could be raised for solitude or lowered for traveling companions. Personal entertainment screens measured 15 inches diagonally larger than many laptop displays. The amenities included noise-canceling headphones, premium bedding, and menus designed by a celebrity chef. The cabin even had its own dedicated lavatory, a significant luxury in air travel's increasingly cramped reality. As Vivian settled into 2A, she observed the social hierarchy established through 100 subtle interactions. A well-known tech CEO in 1D received immediate deferential service. The elderly white couple in 3B and 3C were addressed by name and offered pre-departure beverages before they could request them. The flight attendant's posture and vocal tone shifted perceptibly as they moved between cabins, warm and personalized in front, increasingly standardized and perfunctory toward the back. Her trained eye immediately noticed concerns beyond the service disparities. The safety demonstration equipment hadn't been checked before boarding a basic procedural violation. A flight attendant had greeted a passenger while leaning against the emergency exit door, another clear breach of protocol. The galley hadn't been properly secured, with several service items unsafely positioned for turbulence. These observations weren't just professional critique. Each represented a potential hazard in an emergency, the kind of detail that might seem minor until a crisis made it critical. Vivian documented each violation methodically, her fingers tapping quietly on her tablet's screen as she maintained her cover as a passenger, simply reading an e-book. As the final passengers boarded, Vivian noticed a flight attendant giving her another appraising look. She recognized the expression, the slightly narrowed eyes, the evaluative glance at her simple clothing, the quick scan for visual signifiers of wealth or status. It was a look she'd experienced throughout her life in spaces others believed she didn't belong. Usually she ignored it, but today she was documenting everything. Melissa Sanders moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency. Her SkyWave uniform impeccably pressed, her blonde hair secured in a regulation bun that hadn't moved in her 18 years of flying. At 42, she'd seen the airline industry transform from a service-oriented profession to an exercise in crowd management. She'd survived 3 airline bankruptcies, countless route restructurings, and the complete erosion of the benefits that had originally attracted her to the job. What kept her at SkyWave now was seniority. As head flight attendant, she controlled schedules, assigned positions, and most importantly maintained the unwritten hierarchies that determined which passengers received genuine care and which received merely adequate service. Her philosophy was simple. Those who paid more deserved more, with additional consideration given to frequent flyers, and those who appreciated the value of premium service, a phrase that in practice correlated strongly with older white male passengers. "Mr. Wilkins, lovely to see you again," she said, leaning slightly to speak confidentially to a regular in 1C. "I've made sure we have your preferred scotch available. Will you be dining with us today?" The personalized greeting was one of dozens she'd deliver, each calibrated to the passenger's perceived importance. For elite frequent flyers, she remembered drink preferences and asked about families by name. For occasional premium travelers, she offered professional warmth. For those she deemed one-time upgrades or credit card point redeemers, her service was technically correct but noticeably cooler. She'd already categorized Vivian in the latter group, a passenger who didn't fit her mental image of a typical first-class traveler. No designer luggage, no visible status symbols, no immediate response to the subtle social cues Melissa used to identify her kind of passenger. In Melissa's rigid worldview, first class had an aesthetic, and Vivian's understated appearance didn't match it. While Melissa worked the first-class cabin, Diego Rodriguez restocked supplies in the forward galley. At 29, he represented the new generation of flight attendants, college-educated, multilingual, and drawn to the profession by genuine interest rather than the increasingly mythical perks. With just under a year at SkyWave, he remained on probationary status, making him especially vulnerable to Melissa's performance evaluations and scheduling decisions. Diego noticed everything. He saw how Melissa's tone changed between passengers. He recognized the subtle adjustments in service quality based on appearance and perceived status. He observed the small indignities some passengers experienced while others received preferential treatment. But as a probationary employee and as someone who'd grown up watching his immigrant parents endure similar treatment without complaint, he'd learned to keep his observations to himself. Diego's path to becoming a flight attendant wasn't typical. His father, a former pilot in Mexico who couldn't get his credentials recognized in the U.S., had worked airport maintenance jobs for 30 years. "The sky is still the sky, mijo," his father would say, no matter who controls who flies in it. Diego had promised himself that someday he'd change the industry from within, make it more equitable. But 9 months into his probationary period at SkyWave, survival instincts had largely overridden those ideals. Diego prepared the pre-departure beverages for rows 1 and 2. Melissa directed without making eye contact. Mr. Wilkins in 1C takes Macallan, 12 misses. Friedman in 1A prefers sparkling water with lemon, and Mr. Chen in 1D requested champagne. "What about the passenger in 2A?" Diego asked, having noticed Melissa's omission. Melissa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll handle 2A separately. Focus on the others first." As Diego prepared the drinks, Captain Thomas Reynolds emerged from the cockpit for his pre-departure cabin inspection. At 51, Reynolds carried himself with the confident authority that came from 26 years in the pilot's seat. His uniform was pristine, his command presence undeniable, and his reputation within SkyWave was that of a decisive by-the-book captain, at least when being by the book served his interests. What passengers never saw was Reynolds's other reputation, intolerant of questions from junior officers, dismissive of cabin crew concerns, and notoriously difficult with any passenger he deemed problematic. 3 co-pilots had requested transfers from his crew in the past year alone, citing his intimidating management style and resistance to collaborative cockpit culture. Seated in 2D, Kimberly Foster divided her attention between email responses on her laptop and the interactions around her. As chief operating officer for a major tech company, the 35-year-old executive had developed a keen eye for workplace dynamics. She traveled extensively and had status on multiple airlines, including SkyWave, which gave her ample opportunity to observe how different carriers treated their diverse passengers. She'd noticed the subtle differential treatment since boarding began. The repeated checking of the black woman's boarding pass in 2A, the delayed service, the evaluative glances from both Melissa and Captain Reynolds. It was familiar territory for Kimberly, who had observed similar patterns in corporate environments throughout her career. Unlike many frequent travelers who preferred to remain insulated in their personal technology bubbles, Kimberly paid attention. She believed that privilege came with responsibility, and after years of watching similar scenarios unfold, she'd begun documenting particularly egregious incidents, not for social media outrage, but for quiet conversations with airline executives she knew through business connections. "Excuse me," she said, as Diego passed with drinks. I believe the woman in 2A requested water some time ago." "Yes, ma'am," Diego responded, lowering his voice. "I'll bring it right away." The final supporting player in the unfolding drama hadn't yet boarded the aircraft. Jackson Hayes, SkyWave's ground operations manager at JFK, was currently escorting two late-arriving executives to the gate. At 40, Hayes had built his career on efficiency metrics and strict adherence to corporate priorities. His team consistently achieved on-time departures, baggage handling targets, and turnaround time statistics that had earned him recognition from headquarters and potential promotion considerations. What his impressive metrics concealed was how these results were achieved by creating pressure environments where employees cut corners by accommodating elite passengers at the expense of others, and by fostering a culture where questioning practices was discouraged. Hayes wasn't malicious. He simply prioritized measurable outcomes over passenger experience or employee welfare. "We'll have you on board immediately," he assured the executives as they approached the gate. "I've already notified the crew to prepare for your arrival." One executive checked his watch. "We're pushing the departure time. Will this delay the flight?" Hayes smiled confidently. "Not at all, sir. We've built flexibility into the boarding process. The aircraft is fully ready and we can make adjustments as needed to ensure on-time departure." As the executives prepared to board, the stage was set for conflict. Melissa's rigid hierarchies, Reynolds' authoritarian approach, Hayes's metrics-driven decisions, and Diego's reluctant compliance had created an environment where discrimination could flourish under the guise of customer service prioritization. Only Kimberly seemed poised to potentially intervene, while Vivian continued her quiet observation and documentation. "Pre-departure beverage, sir." Melissa offered the businessman in 1B, her practiced smile warm and attentive. She'd already served most of the first-class cabin, remembering preferences and addressing frequent flyers by name. The personalized service created an atmosphere of exclusive care for most passengers. Vivian observed the pattern from seat 2A, where her request for water remained unfulfilled 15 minutes after boarding. It was a small discrepancy, but a telling one. As she documented the oversight in her tablet, she maintained her cover as an ordinary passenger, occasionally glancing out the window at ground operations to disguise her true focus. The Boeing 787's first-class cabin was nearly full now, with only 2 seats remaining for the late-arriving executives. The usual pre-departure rhythm continued: overhead bins, closing safety demonstrations being prepared, final passengers navigating the increasingly crowded aisle. To casual observers, everything appeared normal. To Vivian's trained eye, concerning patterns were emerging. "Excuse me," she said, as Diego passed with a tray of champagne flutes. "I requested water some time ago." Diego paused, genuine concern crossing his features. "I'm very sorry about that. I'll bring it right away." "No need to bother," Melissa interjected, appearing suddenly beside him. "I'll handle Ms." She glanced at her passenger manifest with exaggerated attention. Blackwell. The deliberate checking of her name, despite having reviewed the manifest multiple times during boarding, was another data point in the emerging pattern. Vivian simply nodded, her expression neutral, despite noting her 4th separate procedural violation: failure to address a passenger service request in a timely manner. When Melissa returned several minutes later with a plastic cup of water rather than the glassware provided to other first-class passengers, Vivian accepted it without comment. The disparate service quality was obvious but difficult to definitively prove, as intentional precisely the kind of subtle discrimination that passengers often reported, but airlines easily denied. Nearby Kimberly Foster observed the interaction while appearing absorbed in her laptop. She'd noticed the mounting differential treatment, the delayed service, the plastic versus glass, the way Melissa's tone shifted when addressing Vivian compared to other passengers. It was a familiar pattern to anyone attuned to such behaviors, though carefully executed to maintain plausible deniability. As the announcement concluded, Jackson Hayes appeared at the aircraft door with the 2 late-arriving executives, middle-aged white men in expensive suits, carrying briefcases emblazoned with the SkyWave corporate logo. Their expressions conveyed the casual entitlement of those accustomed to special treatment. "Melissa, these gentlemen are from headquarters," Hayes said, his voice carrying a clear message about their importance. "They'll need first-class accommodation." Melissa's smile didn't waver, though Vivian noticed her quick scan of the cabin, taking inventory of who might be moved to accommodate the corporate VIPs. Her gaze lingered on Vivian before she responded. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. We'll make appropriate arrangements immediately." The subtext was clear to everyone familiar with airline operations. Someone would be downgraded to make room, and the criteria for selection would inevitably reflect the unwritten hierarchies that governed such decisions. Vivian continued documenting now, recording both the procedural violations and the emerging discriminatory pattern. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit again, exchanging quiet words with Melissa while repeatedly glancing toward Vivian's seat. Their conversation, though inaudible, featured familiar body language, the subtle head tilt toward a passenger being discussed, the slightly lowered voices, the evaluative expressions. Vivian had witnessed similar conversations throughout her career, both as an inspector and as a black woman who often found herself being discussed rather than addressed. "Upgrades again," Reynolds said, his voice deliberately loud enough to be overhead. "Corporate needs to stop giving away premium seats to people who don't normally fly first class. It creates expectations we can't consistently meet." The comment wasn't explicitly directed at anyone, but the timing and volume made its target clear. It was a common tactic, making generalized statements that established disparaging context without directly addressing individuals. Plausible deniability in action. Diego, restocking supplies in the forward galley, winced slightly at the captain's remark. He'd seen this scenario unfold before: the gradual escalation of differential treatment, the establishment of pretexts for subsequent actions, the careful creation of an environment where discrimination could occur without explicit acknowledgement. "We have a potential solution," Melissa informed Hayes quietly. "We've identified a passenger we can relocate to accommodate the executives." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Good. Whatever's necessary to ensure our VIPs are properly situated. We can't have headquarters staff experiencing anything less than our premium service." Throughout this exchange, Vivian maintained her outward calm while documenting every word, glance, and action. Her tablet recorded timestamps, individuals involved, and specific behaviors, creating a comprehensive record that would be difficult to dispute later. What appeared to the crew as a passenger absorbed in reading was actually a federal inspector building a detailed case file. The forward cabin door closed with a distinctive thunk as the aircraft prepared for departure. The late-arriving executives had been comfortably settled in First Class 1 in Vivian's originally assigned Seat 2A, the other in the last remaining unoccupied premium seat. The boarding process was complete, but the situation continued to escalate as Melissa stood expectantly over Vivian, clearly waiting for compliance with the requested move. "As I mentioned," Vivian reiterated calmly, "I have a confirmed reservation for this specific seat. I'd like to understand the exact operational reason I'm being asked to relocate when other passengers were accommodated without displacement." Melissa's professional veneer thinned visibly. "Ms. Blackwell, we need to prepare for departure. The decision has been made based on operational priorities that I'm not at liberty to fully discuss. We're offering generous compensation for the inconvenience." The explanation remained deliberately vague: operational priorities, rather than the simple truth that corporate executives were being prioritized over a paying passenger with an identical class of service. It was textbook discriminatory treatment disguised as procedural necessity, executed with the confidence of routine practice. From the cockpit doorway, Captain Reynolds observed the situation with growing impatience. After a brief, whispered conversation with Hayes, he approached with the unmistakable posture of authority, prepared to resolve what he perceived as an unnecessary delay. "Is there a problem here?" He asked, his question ostensibly directed at both Melissa and Vivian, but his attention focused solely on the latter. This passenger is refusing our reasonable accommodation request." Melissa explained her tone, suggesting Vivian was being difficult rather than simply asserting her rights to a confirmed reservation. Reynolds turned fully toward Vivian now, his expression stern. "Ma'am, we need to prepare for departure. The crew has made a determination based on operational requirements. Your cooperation is expected." The escalation was textbook from flight attendant to captain, from request to demand, from customer service interaction to subtle intimidation. It reflected a calculated approach to passenger management, particularly when dealing with those deemed less important or potentially problematic. Nearby passengers had begun to notice the confrontation. Some studiously avoided eye contact, retreating into personal devices or suddenly finding the safety card fascinating. Others watched with uncomfortable recognition of the dynamics at play. A few, including Kimberly, continued documenting discreetly. An older white businessman in 4B leaned toward his companion and muttered audibly, "Some people just don't know how to behave in first class." His companion nodded in agreement, adding to the atmosphere of isolation around Vivian. In stark contrast, a young Asian woman in 5D had already begun recording the interaction on her phone, her expression one of concerned recognition. A middle-aged black man in 3F watched intently, his jaw tightening with each escalating exchange, clearly recognizing a familiar pattern unfolding. Captain Vivian responded, her voice steady. "I understand operational requirements sometimes necessitate changes. However, I've not been provided with a specific reason why my confirmed reservation is being invalidated while other passengers remain accommodated." The reasonable question visibly irritated Reynolds, whose expression hardened further. "The reason is that we have company executives who require appropriate accommodation. This is a simple matter of prioritization." His blunt admission that corporate employees were being prioritized over paying passengers with confirmed reservations hung in the air. It was precisely the kind of statement airline policies typically avoided explicitly making, though the practice was common. The captain's frustration had led him to articulate what was usually left implicit. "I see," Vivian replied, her tone neutral as she made another note on her tablet. "So my confirmed first-class reservation is being invalidated specifically to accommodate airline employees who arrived after boarding was nearly complete." Reynolds's jaw tightened at having the situation stated so directly. "Ma'am, this isn't a negotiation. We have procedures and hierarchies that determine these decisions." From the galley, Diego watched with increasing discomfort. The procedures and hierarchies Reynolds referenced weren't found in any official manual. They were the unwritten rules that determined which passengers deserved respect and which could be inconvenienced. His father's words echoed in his mind. The sky is still the sky, no matter who controls who flies in it. As a probationary employee, he remained silent despite his growing conviction that he was witnessing something fundamentally wrong. What specific SkyWave policy authorizes displacing a passenger with a confirmed reservation to accommodate non-revenue corporate personnel? Vivian asked her question, precision targeted to expose the absence of formal policy supporting their actions. The direct challenge to authority visibly unsettled both Reynolds and Melissa, who exchanged glances communicating shared frustration. This passenger wasn't following the expected script of reluctant compliance, followed by ineffective complaints to customer service after the fact. "This is delaying our departure," Reynolds stated, ignoring the question entirely. "Ms. Blackwell, you have two options. Accept the offered accommodation in premium economy, or we can arrange for you to take a later flight." The false choice presented as reasonable alternatives, but actually constituting significant service failures in both cases, was another common tactic. It framed the passenger as unreasonable for expecting their confirmed reservation to be honored while presenting the airline's failure as generous accommodation. From across the aisle, Kimberly Foster finally spoke up. "Excuse me, Captain, but I've been monitoring this situation and I'm concerned about what appears to be selective enforcement of policies. As a frequent SkyWave passenger myself, I'd like to understand the specific policy being applied here." Reynolds turned toward Kimberly with visible surprise, clearly not expecting intervention from another first-class passenger. "Ma'am, this is between the crew and Ms. Blackwell. We appreciate your concern, but this is an operational matter. An operational matter that seems to be based on considerations other than standard procedures," Kimberly responded, her professional experience evident in her composed but direct challenge. "I've flown SkyWave weekly for 5 years, and I've never witnessed a passenger with a confirmed reservation being displaced for non-revenue personnel, except in cases of aircraft changes or mechanical issues. Have you ever been treated unfairly while traveling? Comment below with your experience and hit subscribe to see how this confrontation unfolds." "Ms. Blackwell, this is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily," Melissa stated, her customer service demeanor now fully replaced by authoritarian rigidity. "We need all passengers in their assigned seats for departure." The irony of the statement, given that Vivian was literally being told to vacate her assigned seat, wasn't lost on the surrounding passengers. Several had abandoned any pretense of not watching the confrontation, while others continued documenting discreetly from behind phones and tablets. To be clear, Vivian responded, her voice measured but firm. "You're asking me to leave my confirmed seat to accommodate late-arriving airline executives, and you're citing a computer error that somehow wasn't detected during multiple confirmation checks." The direct articulation of what was actually happening, stripped of euphemisms and corporate doublespeak, visibly unsettled both Melissa and Reynolds. It exposed the fundamental dishonesty underlying their approach, the invention of technical issues to justify preferential treatment, the displacement of a paying passenger for non-revenue personnel, and the escalation to threats when these actions were questioned. Captain Reynolds stepped closer, looming over Vivian's seat in a posture clearly intended to intimidate. His face flushed red at the temples, a vein visibly pulsing at his neck as he leaned down, invading her personal space. "Ma'am, we're not asking. We're informing you of an operational decision. Your options are to move to the offered seat in premium economy or to deplane and take a later flight. Those are your only choices at this point." The confrontation had now drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the forward cabins. The Asian woman in 5D had positioned her phone to capture everything, while a businessman in business class had stood to get a better view of the unfolding drama. An older woman clutched her pearls in visible discomfort, while a teenage boy whispered excitedly to his father, "Dad, this is going viral for sure." Diego, unable to remain silent any longer, approached cautiously. "Captain, if I may, perhaps we could offer Ms. Blackwell compensation for the inconvenience. A travel voucher or additional miles might—" "That's enough," Rodriguez Reynolds interrupted sharply, spinning toward him with unexpected ferocity. "Return to your duties. This doesn't concern you." The dismissal was immediate and absolute, a clear message that junior crew members should not question decisions or suggest alternatives, particularly when those alternatives might acknowledge wrongdoing. Diego retreated to the galley, his discomfort visibly intensified, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged glasses on a service tray. From across the aisle, Kimberly Foster continued recording, while simultaneously sending text messages, her corporate seniority evident in her willingness to challenge the situation directly. "Captain Reynolds," she said firmly, "I'm documenting this interaction because it appears to violate SkyWave's own stated policies regarding confirmed reservations. As a major corporate client with substantial annual spending across your network, I find this treatment concerning." The invocation of corporate client status, suggesting potential financial implications beyond this single incident, shifted Reynolds' attention momentarily. Corporate accounts represented significant revenue, and SkyWave, like most airlines, prioritized maintaining these relationships. "Ms. Foster, I appreciate your concern," Reynolds replied, his tone noticeably modulated. "But this is a straightforward operational matter that we're handling according to established procedures. Which specific procedure authorizes displacing a passenger with a confirmed reservation to accommodate late-arriving non-revenue personnel?" Kimberly pressed, echoing Vivian's earlier question that had remained conspicuously unanswered. Reynolds's jaw tightened at the repeated challenge. "Ladies, this is delaying our departure. We need to resolve this situation immediately." Throughout the exchange, Vivian remained outwardly composed while continuing to document everything on her tablet, each justification, each threat, each procedural violation, building a comprehensive case file. Her professional training allowed her to recognize the escalation pattern unfolding from denial of service disparities to invented technical issues to implicit threats of removal. The businessman who had earlier made the disparaging comment leaned forward again. "Just move her already. Some of us have important meetings to get to." His outburst drew several disapproving glances, but also a few nodding heads, creating a visible division among the passengers witnessing the confrontation. In contrast, the middle-aged black man in 3F finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I've seen this movie before, Captain. It doesn't end well for the airline. Let's be completely transparent." Reynolds finally stated, abandoning pretense. "The passengers we're accommodating are senior operations executives whose travel takes priority over regular bookings. This isn't personal, it's simply a matter of company hierarchy." The blunt admission that corporate position outweighed confirmed passenger reservations hung in the air. It was precisely the kind of statement airline policies typically avoided explicitly making, though the practice was common. The captain's frustration had led him to articulate what was usually left implicit. "I understand," Vivian replied, making another note. "And is this prioritization policy documented somewhere? I'd be interested in reviewing it." The reasonable question pushed Reynolds beyond his already limited patience. Security to the forward cabin, he spoke into his handheld radio. "We have a non-compliant passenger." The dramatic escalation from customer service dispute to security matter transformed the atmosphere instantly. Nearby passengers exchanged alarmed glances, more phones emerged to record the situation, and even some of the previously disinterested travelers turned to observe the unfolding drama. The Asian woman who had been recording gasped audibly, her eyes widening at this extreme response to what had been a calm, reasoned interaction. Jackson Hayes, who had remained near the forward galley monitoring the situation, stepped forward again. "Captain, perhaps we should discuss options before involving security. A delay for passenger removal will impact our departure metrics significantly. The intervention wasn't based on concern for fair treatment, but rather on operational statistics, Hayes's primary focus as ground operations manager. A formal removal would require paperwork, potential rebooking, and official incident reports, all of which would affect his department's performance metrics." "The decision is made," Reynolds replied firmly. "We've provided reasonable alternatives which have been refused. We're now proceeding according to non-compliance protocols." As airport security personnel appeared at the aircraft door, the situation had escalated far beyond a simple seating dispute. What had begun as subtle service disparities had progressed through invented technical justifications to outright threats, and now to potential forced removal, all because a passenger had calmly questioned discriminatory treatment and expected policy consistency. "Ms. Blackwell," Melissa stated with artificial regret, "you've left us no choice but to have you escorted from the aircraft. We'll rebook you on a later flight and process appropriate compensation for the inconvenience." Throughout the cabin, reactions varied widely. Some passengers studiously avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to intervene. Others watched openly, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern to outright disapproval. A few, including Kimberly, continued documenting everything, creating a record that would ultimately prove crucial. As security personnel approached, Vivian finally stood. Her movement was calm and deliberate, without the emotional reaction the crew had perhaps anticipated. She gathered her belongings methodically, placing her tablet in her messenger bag with particular care. "I'll relocate as requested," she stated clearly, "though I want it noted that I'm doing so under protest and only to avoid further disruption to other passengers." The unexpected compliance momentarily confused the crew, who had clearly prepared for either continued resistance or emotional outburst. Vivian's reasonable approach denied them, both maintaining her dignity while still documenting the discriminatory treatment. "Thank you for your cooperation," Melissa responded, her relief evident. "Diego will escort you to your new seat in premium economy." "Actually," Vivian corrected calmly, "I believe I was being relocated to economy, not premium economy. At least that's what Captain Reynolds stated earlier." Reynolds' expression confirmed the bait and switch, another common tactic in which initial offers of premium economy frequently transformed to standard economy once compliance was secured. "Economy is all that's available at this point," he confirmed tersely. "I understand," Vivian replied, making one final note on her tablet before securing it in her bag. "I'd appreciate a record of this interaction and the specific policies applied for my future reference." The reasonable request for documentation of what had occurred visibly irritated Reynolds further. "You'll need to contact customer relations after your flight. We're proceeding with departure now." As Vivian prepared to follow Diego toward the economy section, Kimberly Foster intervened one final time. "Ms. Blackwell, I've documented this entire interaction. I'd be happy to share the recording with you for your records." The offer of independent documentation coming from another passenger rather than crew created a moment of uncertain tension. Reynolds and Melissa exchanged concerned glances, suddenly aware that their actions might be scrutinized beyond this immediate situation. "That won't be necessary," Reynolds stated firmly. "We have our own records of all on-board interactions." Nevertheless, Kimberly persisted, handing Vivian a business card. "Please contact me if you need an objective account of what transpired here today." The simple act of solidarity, one passenger supporting another's right to fair treatment, represented exactly the kind of alliance that discriminatory systems relied on not forming. It was the unexpected variable in what had otherwise been a familiar script of isolation, intimidation, and eventual compliance. As Diego led Vivian toward the economy section, the confrontation had seemingly concluded with the airline's authority asserted and the problem passenger removed from premium cabins. What none of the crew realized was that the real consequences were just beginning, that what they perceived as routine passenger management was actually creating a documented case that would ultimately transform their entire organization. The walk from first class to economy wasn't merely a journey of physical distance, it was a deliberately choreographed experience in status reduction. As Diego led Vivian through the premium cabins toward the back of the aircraft, each section represented a visible step down in comfort service and perceived importance. Business class passengers glanced up curiously as they passed, some recognizing the unusual sight of a passenger being relocated after boarding was complete. In premium economy, the seats were still relatively spacious, the amenities still suggesting some level of consideration for passenger comfort. But as they continued toward standard economy, the environment changed dramatically. The aisle narrowed. Overhead bins bulged with hastily stowed luggage. The seating density increased noticeably, with passengers already squeezed shoulder to shoulder in the 333 configuration. The cabin's lighting seemed harsher, the air slightly warmer, the overall atmosphere more reminiscent of public transportation than premium travel. Throughout the aircraft, phones tracked their progress. The confrontation in first class had already triggered a wave of digital documentation, with passengers texting friends, uploading clips to social media, and live commenting on the unfolding situation. By the time Vivian reached row 30, hashtags like #SkyWaveShame and #FirstClass, while black, were already beginning to circulate on Twitter and Instagram. "I'm really sorry about this," Diego said quietly as they moved through the crowded space. His genuine discomfort was evident in both his expression and posture, the demeanor of someone participating in something they knew was wrong but felt powerless to prevent. His hands fidgeted with his tie, his usual professional composure cracking under the weight of complicity. "My father always said that the true character of a business shows in how they treat people when they think no one important is watching," he added in a near whisper, glancing around to ensure no other crew members could hear. He would be ashamed of what I'm doing right now. Vivian maintained her composed exterior while noting every detail of the experience. The relocation wasn't simply about a different seat. It was about a visible diminishment of status, a public demonstration of hierarchical enforcement. The message being communicated both to her and to observing passengers was clear. Some travelers belonged in premium spaces, while others could be displaced at will. As they approached the rear of the aircraft, Diego's discomfort visibly increased. "We're almost there," he said, his voice lowered further. "They've assigned you to 42E. The seat assignment, a middle position in the last row of the aircraft directly adjacent to the lavatories, represented the worst possible location on the entire plane. It combined minimal personal space with maximum disruption from both passenger traffic and bathroom doors. The selection couldn't have been more punitive if deliberately designed as such, which Vivian suspected it likely was. Passengers, already seated in the surrounding rows, watched curiously as Diego attempted to find overhead space for Vivian's carry-on bag. The bins were completely full, requiring him to ask several passengers to rearrange their items to accommodate one more bag. "I can just keep it under the seat," Vivian offered, noting the additional disruption being created. "I'm sorry, but there's insufficient space for proper legroom with a bag," Diego explained apologetically. Aircraft regulations require clear floor space in seated rows. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. These same regulations had been conspicuously ignored in the premium cabins where passengers routinely kept larger items at their feet without crew intervention. It was another example of the selective enforcement that characterized different service levels. After several more minutes of rearranging, Diego finally secured Vivian's bag in an overhead compartment, several rows forward, creating the additional inconvenience of having to move against passenger flow when retrieving it later. "Here we are," he said as they reached row 42. Middle seat. The space was exactly as expected, tightly confined between two already seated passengers directly opposite the lavatories and in the area of maximum noise and disruption. The seat itself appeared narrower than others, the cushion visibly worn from countless previous occupants. As Vivian settled into the middle position, her neighbors, a businessman typing aggressively on his laptop, and an elderly woman already leaning against the window, acknowledged her with the briefest of nods before returning to their respective activities. Neither moved their elbows from the shared armrests, leaving Vivian in the cramped middle position with no personal space whatsoever. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Diego?" asked, his discomfort with the situation evident in his reluctance to leave. "No, thank you," Vivian replied calmly. "I appreciate your assistance." As Diego retreated toward the forward cabins, Vivian took a moment to fully observe her new surroundings. The contrast with first class was stark in every conceivable dimension, from physical comfort to air quality to noise levels to basic courtesy. It was a deliberately different experience by design, but the transition between them was rarely experienced so directly as through forced relocation. From across the aisle, a young woman caught Vivian's eye. "Were you just moved from first class?" she asked quietly. Vivian nodded, maintaining her professional composure. "Yes, apparently to accommodate airline executives who arrived late." The young woman's expression reflected immediate understanding. "That happened to my mother last month on their Chicago route. They claimed it was a computer error, too. I filed a complaint, but never heard back." The casual confirmation of a pattern that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a recurring practice, added another data point to Vivian's growing case file. She made a mental note to research previous complaints about SkyWave's Route 327, specifically suspecting she would find similar reports. A college student 2 rows ahead turned around. "I got it all on video," he said, holding up his phone. "Already at 3,000 views on TikTok." #SkyWave shame is trending. The digital dimension of the incident was spreading faster than Vivian had anticipated. What the crew had treated as a routine passenger management issue was rapidly transforming into a viral social media moment with potential implications far beyond this single flight or passenger experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds," came the announcement over the intercom. "We're completing our final preparations for departure. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for takeoff." The standard announcement carried additional significance for Vivian, who recognized it as confirmation that her relocation had been the final obstacle to departure from the crew's perspective. The problem had been addressed, the hierarchy reinforced, and normal operations could now resume. As the safety demonstration began, Vivian noted multiple procedural violations in the economy cabin that hadn't been present in first class. Flight attendants rushed through required elements. Oxygen mask demonstrations were performed incorrectly, and several passengers with headphones weren't asked to remove them despite regulatory requirements. Most concerning was the ceiling panel above row 38 visibly misaligned with a concerning gap that revealed a glimpse of improperly secured equipment above. As an aviation safety inspector specializing in cabin compliance, Vivian immediately recognized the potential hazard. The oxygen mask deployment system appeared improperly connected, a critical safety violation that could prove fatal in an emergency decompression scenario. These disparities weren't simply matters of comfort or convenience. They represented potential safety issues that could become critical in emergency situations. The uneven application of safety procedures based on cabin class created vulnerabilities that affected all passengers regardless of seating assignment. Throughout the demonstration, Vivian maintained her role as a seemingly ordinary passenger while continuing to document everything she observed. What the crew didn't realize was that their discriminatory treatment had placed a federal safety inspector in the perfect position to observe and record violations throughout the entire aircraft, rather than just the first-class cabin. As the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, the final humiliation manifested in the form of a lavatory door that repeatedly swung open during movement directly facing Vivian's seat. Despite multiple attempts to secure it, the latch was clearly defective, another maintenance issue that had been overlooked during pre-flight inspections. The physical discomfort, public dimension of the displacement, and overall disparate treatment combined to create exactly the kind of experience the crew had likely intended, one that demonstrated authority, reinforced hierarchy, and discouraged future questioning of crew decisions. What they couldn't have anticipated was that this attempt at passenger management would ultimately trigger the most comprehensive safety and discrimination investigation in the airline's history. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, Vivian Blackwell wasn't experiencing the humiliation they'd intended. She was methodically building the case that would fundamentally transform SkyWave Airlines from the ground up. Have you ever witnessed discriminatory treatment on a flight? Drop a comment below about your experience. And if you're wondering what happens next, subscribe now, because karma is about to take flight in a way Captain Reynolds never expected. The first significant turbulence hit approximately 40 minutes into the flight. The aircraft dropped suddenly, then shuddered as it encountered unstable air currents at 32,000 feet. Overhead bins rattled, service items clattered in galleys, and the seatbelt sign illuminated with an urgent chime. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds," came the announcement. "We've encountered some unexpected turbulence. All passengers must return to their seats immediately and fasten their seatbelts." In the economy cabin, the effects were particularly pronounced. Without the more sophisticated stabilization systems that dampened movement in premium sections, economy passengers experienced the full force of each jolt. Drinks spilled, personal items slid from tray tables, and several people gasped audibly as the plane bucked against invisible air pockets. During one particularly sharp drop, something happened that caught Vivian's immediate professional attention. The ceiling panel above row 38, the one she'd already noted was misaligned, shifted dramatically, dropping nearly 6 inches and revealing a disturbing gap. Now clearly visible through that gap were the PSU passenger service unit components, including the critical OHR overhead oxygen release mechanisms. Vivian could see immediately that the retention pins on 3 oxygen mask containers were completely missing, and the primary deployment cable was improperly routed around a sharp metal edge, a catastrophic configuration that would likely prevent masks from deploying properly in an emergency. As a senior aviation safety inspector specializing in cabin safety, Vivian recognized the serious implications immediately. This wasn't a cosmetic issue or minor compliance concern. It was a potentially fatal safety hazard that violated multiple FAR Federal Aviation Regulation requirements, particularly FAR 25.1047, governing emergency oxygen systems. Improperly secured oxygen systems could fail during an actual emergency, potentially with catastrophic consequences for dozens of passengers. The visible issue suggested a pattern of maintenance negligence that required immediate investigation. When the turbulence temporarily subsided, Vivian carefully unfastened her seatbelt and stood. "Excuse me," she said to her seatmates as she navigated the tight space to reach the aisle. A flight attendant, not Diego but another crew member assigned to economy, approached quickly. "Ma'am, the seatbelt sign is illuminated. You need to return to your seat immediately." "I understand," Vivian replied calmly. "However, there's a potential safety issue with the ceiling panel near row 38 that needs immediate attention. The oxygen mask packing appears compromised." The flight attendant's expression shifted from authoritarian to uncertain. "I'm sure everything is fine. Our maintenance teams conduct thorough pre-flight inspections." Nevertheless, Vivian persisted. "I'd like to speak with the senior flight attendant about this matter. It's regarding passenger safety." The conflicted flight attendant hesitated, clearly weighing standard procedures against a passenger reporting a potential safety concern. "Please return to your seat. I'll inform Ms. Sanders of your concern." Vivian nodded and returned to 42E, continuing to observe as the flight attendant moved forward through the cabin, presumably to relay the message. Several minutes passed with no response, suggesting her concern had been dismissed or deprioritized, another data point in the pattern of differential treatment and safety standard application. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, Vivian immediately stood again and made her way forward, determined to address the safety issue directly. As she approached the mid-cabin galley, she encountered Diego restocking service items. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I noticed a potential safety issue with the oxygen mask deployment system above row 38. The ceiling panel is loose and the mask packs appear improperly secured. The primary deployment cable is routed incorrectly and at least 3 retention pins are missing entirely." Diego's expression reflected immediate concern rather than dismissal. The technical specificity of her description made it clear this wasn't a casual observation from a nervous passenger. "Thank you for reporting this. I'll check it right away. I'd also like to speak with Ms. Sanders," Vivian added. "This may indicate broader maintenance compliance issues that require documentation. Miss Sanders is currently handling service in first class." Diego replied, his discomfort evident. "I can relay your concern, but she's unlikely to consider it a priority," Vivian finished for him. "I understand." Diego's silence confirmed the assessment. After a moment's consideration, he lowered his voice further. "I'll check the panel myself. If there's an issue, I'll report it directly to the captain regardless of protocol." His willingness to potentially circumvent established hierarchies indicated both the seriousness with which he viewed safety concerns and his growing discomfort with the airline's operational culture. It was the response of a professional committed to passenger safety, despite institutional pressures. Together they moved to row 38, where Diego examined the loose ceiling panel with growing concern. "You're right," he confirmed quietly. "The retaining clips are missing, and the oxygen container isn't properly secured. The deployment cable is routed incorrectly, too. This should have been caught during pre-flight inspection." "Are you authorized to check other panels?" Vivian asked, knowing the answer but establishing the record. Technically, no, Diego admitted. Only maintenance personnel or the lead flight attendant should conduct interior component inspections during flight. Then I believe we need to involve Ms. Sanders immediately, Vivian stated firmly. This represents a potential pattern of maintenance negligence that could affect multiple aircraft systems. Diego nodded reluctantly and used the interphone to contact the forward galley. The brief conversation was inaudible to passengers, but his expression suggested resistance from the senior crew member. Finally, he returned to Vivian. She says she's too busy with premium service to address this right now. She suggested filing a report after landing. The dismissal of a legitimate safety concern based on cabin assignment priorities represented a serious regulatory violation, one that transformed Vivian's inspection from routine observation to potential enforcement action. The moment had arrived to partially reveal her actual role. "Diego," she said quietly, removing her FAA credentials from her messenger bag. "My name is Vivian Blackwell. I'm a senior aviation safety inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration, currently conducting an evaluation of SkyWave's operational compliance on this route." The transformation in Diego's expression was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened to an almost comical degree, his mouth dropping open in shock. The color drained from his face as he processed not just the identification, but its implications that the passenger they had humiliated and displaced was actually a federal inspector with the authority to ground aircraft, suspend certifications, and initiate enforcement actions that could affect the entire airline. "You're with the FAA." Diego managed his voice barely above a whisper as he stared at the credentials. "This is an official inspection." "It is," Vivian confirmed calmly. "And I need you to immediately inform Captain Reynolds that there's an FAA inspector on board reporting critical safety violations that require immediate documentation and assessment. Specifically, tell him I've identified PCSM Type A violations under CFR Title 14, Part 25.1447 with potential airworthiness implications. The technical specificity referencing passenger cabin safety mechanism violations, and the specific federal regulation governing emergency oxygen systems left no doubt about her expertise or authority." Diego's professional demeanor shifted accordingly, all hesitation replaced by protocol adherence. "Yes, Inspector Blackwell," he responded formally, straightening his posture. "I'll inform the captain immediately." Several passengers nearby had witnessed the exchange, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning understanding. The college student who had recorded the earlier confrontation was already typing rapidly on his phone, likely sharing this new development with his growing social media audience. "Is she really with the FAA?" a woman whispered loudly to her companion. "The airline picked the wrong passenger to mess with," came the reply, followed by a low whistle. As Diego moved quickly toward the front of the aircraft, Vivian remained by the compromised panel, continuing her inspection while waiting for the inevitable response. The power reversal was unfolding exactly as anticipated, from dismissal to urgent attention, from passenger to authority figure, from problem to priority. Within minutes, the aircraft interphone chimed with an all-crew notification. Melissa Sanders appeared almost immediately, her expression transitioning from annoyance to alarm as she approached row 38. Her brisk, confident stride faltered visibly as she spotted Vivian's credentials, still displayed for documentation purposes. "Ms. Blackwell," she began, her tone noticeably modulated from their previous interaction, "I understand you've identified a potential safety concern." "Not potential, Ms. Sanders," actual Vivian corrected professionally, her voice carrying just enough to ensure nearby passengers could hear. "This panel is improperly secured, and the oxygen mask deployment system behind it appears compromised. As Senior Aviation Safety Inspector, I'm documenting this as a critical safety violation requiring immediate reporting to your maintenance control." The color drained from Melissa's face as she processed both the safety issue and the inspector's identity. The implications were immediately clear, not just for the specific violation, but for the entire interaction that had preceded it, from the discriminatory treatment to the forced relocation to the dismissal of reported concerns. We weren't aware of your status," Melissa managed, struggling to maintain professional composure. "That's precisely the point," Ms. Sanders Vivian replied evenly. "Standard safety protocols and passenger treatment shouldn't depend on a traveler's status or position. They should be applied consistently regardless of who the passenger is or where they're seated." The statement, delivered without anger but with unmistakable authority, crystallized the fundamental issue at the heart of the incident. It wasn't just about one passenger's treatment or one safety violation, but about institutional patterns that created differential standards based on perceived importance or status. Before Melissa could respond further, Captain Reynolds' voice came over the intercom. "This is the captain speaking. We're initiating a special inspection procedure throughout the cabin. Flight attendants will be checking ceiling panels and other interior components. This is standard procedure and no cause for concern." The announcement, attempting to normalize what was actually an emergency inspection triggered by a federal inspector's findings, reflected the crew's immediate shift to damage control mode. What had begun as discriminatory passenger treatment had escalated to potentially serious regulatory violations with implications far beyond this single flight. As additional crew members converged on the economy section to begin inspections, Kimberly Foster appeared, having made her way back from first class. "I heard there might be safety concerns," she said, approaching Vivian. "Is everything all right, Ms. Foster?" Vivian acknowledged professionally. "There are some compliance issues being addressed. I appreciate your earlier intervention regarding the seating situation." Kimberly nodded, then lowered her voice. "So, you're not just an ordinary passenger, are you?" "I'm with the Federal Aviation Administration," Vivian confirmed quietly, showing her credentials briefly. "This flight was scheduled for regulatory compliance review following multiple passenger complaints." Understanding dawned in Kimberly's expression, followed by a small, satisfied smile. "And they happened to select you for displacement of all people." "That's unfortunate timing for them." "Timing is certainly a factor," Vivian agreed with professional neutrality, "though their actions would represent violations regardless of the passenger involved." Their conversation was interrupted as Diego returned, his expression a mixture of concern and vindication. "Inspector Blackwell, we've found 2 additional panels with similar issues. Captain Reynolds requests your presence in the forward cabin to discuss the findings." The invitation, or more accurately, the attempt to move the inspector away from public view during discussions, was transparent in its intent. Reynolds clearly preferred to address the situation privately, rather than having a federal inspector documenting violations in full view of passengers. "Please inform the captain that I'll continue my inspection here first," Vivian replied professionally. "I need to complete documentation of all identified issues before discussion. FAA protocols require comprehensive evidence collection before remediation planning." The response, entirely accurate regarding inspection procedures, effectively denied the captain's attempt to control the situation. It maintained Vivian's authority while ensuring the violations were fully documented before any potential management efforts could minimize them. As word spread throughout the cabin, the atmosphere transformed dramatically. Crew members who had previously ignored economy passengers suddenly appeared attentive and solicitous. Passengers who had witnessed Vivian's earlier treatment now observed the reversal with expressions ranging from surprise to satisfaction. The power dynamics that had seemed so firmly established during boarding had completely inverted. The college student who had been documenting the incident leaned forward from his seat. "This is better than any movie," he whispered to his seatmate. Captain picked on the one black woman on the plane who turned out to be a federal inspector. FAA justice is already trending. In first class, the corporate executives who had been accommodated at Vivian's expense were now being quietly informed of the situation by increasingly anxious crew members. One executive's face visibly paled as he realized the implications, immediately pulling out his phone to send what appeared to be urgent messages. As inspections continued throughout the cabin, revealing additional maintenance and safety issues, the full implications became increasingly clear to everyone involved. What had begun as routine discriminatory treatment, the kind passengers experienced daily without recourse, had escalated into a documented pattern of regulatory violations that could potentially affect SkyWave's operating certificate. When Captain Reynolds finally emerged from the cockpit to personally address the situation, his transformation was remarkable. Gone was the arrogant authority figure who had loomed over Vivian earlier. In his place stood a visibly shaken man whose professional future now hung in the balance. His face had lost its confident color, his previously commanding posture now uncertain as he approached. "Inspector Blackwell," he began, his voice carefully modulated to project professional respect rather than his earlier condescension. "I understand you've identified some concerns that require immediate attention." "That's correct, Captain Reynolds," Vivian replied, her tone unchanged from their previous interaction, professional, measured, and focused on regulatory matters rather than personal vindication. "I've documented multiple safety violations requiring immediate notification to both SkyWave Maintenance Control and the FAA Enforcement Division." The power reversal wasn't simply about individual vindication. It represented the regulatory oversight system functioning exactly as designed, identifying violations, documenting non-compliance, and ensuring accountability regardless of who was involved or how the discoveries occurred. For Vivian Blackwell, it wasn't personal satisfaction driving her methodical documentation, it was professional responsibility and the memory of her brother Michael, whose life had been lost to similar patterns of maintenance neglect and procedural disregard. Each violation documented represented potential lives protected, each accountability measure a step toward preventing similar tragedies. The transformation was complete. The very authority figures who had orchestrated Vivian's humiliation now approached her with formal deference, suddenly acutely aware that their actions hadn't merely inconvenienced a passenger, they had potentially jeopardized their entire airline's regulatory standing. "When you look at someone and make assumptions based on appearance," Vivian stated clearly loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "you're not just risking discrimination complaints. You're potentially compromising the very safety systems you're responsible for maintaining." The statement encapsulating the connection between discriminatory treatment and safety implications would later be quoted in training materials throughout the industry. But in this moment it simply hung in the air as Captain Reynolds absorbed its full meaning, along with the growing recognition that his career might not survive the day's events. The remainder of the flight unfolded in an atmosphere of tense professionalism. After comprehensive documentation of all identified safety issues, Vivian had finally agreed to a brief meeting with Captain Reynolds in the forward galley area. Their conversation, though conducted in professional tones, carried clearly to nearby passengers. Inspector Blackwell Reynolds began, his earlier arrogance replaced by careful formality. "I want to assure you that SkyWave takes safety compliance extremely seriously. The issues you've identified appear to be isolated anomalies that slipped through our normal inspection procedures." Captain Vivian responded evenly. "My preliminary findings suggest otherwise. We've identified 5 separate critical safety violations in this aircraft, all of which should have been detected during routine pre-flight inspections. This indicates potential structural problems in your maintenance oversight system rather than isolated incidents." The assessment, delivered with clinical precision rather than accusation, clearly unsettled Reynolds, whose expression tightened further. "We'll certainly conduct a thorough review of our procedures following this flight. The FAA will be conducting its own review," Vivian clarified professionally. "I've already initiated emergency safety verification protocols for SkyWave's entire fleet based on today's findings." The statement hung in the air between them, its implications extending far beyond this single aircraft or flight crew. Emergency verification protocols typically triggered comprehensive inspections across an airline's entire operation, potentially grounding multiple aircraft and disrupting thousands of flights until all safety concerns were addressed. That seems disproportionate based on findings from one aircraft. Reynolds protested, his composure slipping slightly. The findings themselves warrant verification across your fleet, Vivian explained calmly. However, I should note that the inspection protocols were escalated due to the crew's initial dismissal of reported safety concerns based on cabin class distinctions, a separate regulatory violation that suggests institutional cultural issues rather than isolated judgment errors. The direct reference to their earlier treatment of her when they believed she was simply a passenger who could be disregarded visibly unsettled Reynolds further. The recognition that their discriminatory behavior had directly contributed to escalated regulatory consequences was clearly beginning to register. As they concluded their discussion, Melissa Sanders approached with visible apprehension. "Inspector Blackwell, I wanted to personally apologize for the confusion regarding your seating assignment earlier. There was clearly a misunderstanding about operational requirements." "Was there, Ms. Sanders?" Vivian replied neutrally. "Because my documentation indicates you specifically stated the displacement was to accommodate late-arriving corporate executives, which directly contradicts SkyWave's published policies regarding confirmed reservations." The precise citation of her earlier statements evidenced that the inspector had been documenting everything from the beginning left Melissa momentarily speechless. The realization that their actions had been recorded in detail by a federal authority was clearly setting in. That was a mischaracterization on my part," Melissa attempted. "Our actual procedure is, we'll address all procedural violations in my formal report," Vivian interjected professionally. "For now, I suggest focusing on addressing the immediate safety concerns for the remainder of this flight." Throughout the cabin, the ripple effects of the revealed inspection continued expanding. The digital dimension was particularly dramatic. Passengers who had recorded the earlier confrontation were now capturing the aftermath, creating a narrative arc that was spreading rapidly across social media platforms. "This is insane," the college student whispered to his seatmate, checking his phone. "My TikTok from earlier has over 200,000 views already. @SkyWave Shame and #Black in First Class are trending nationally. Someone even started a FAA takedown tag." The social media explosion represented an unprecedented dimension of accountability, one that transformed what might have remained an isolated regulatory matter into a public relations crisis with immediate business implications. Corporate communications teams were already scrambling to respond as clips spread across platforms, creating viral momentum that outpaced traditional damage control measures. As Vivian made her way back toward her assigned economy seat, she was intercepted by Diego, who had been conducting thorough safety checks throughout the economy section. "Inspector Blackwell," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for identifying these issues. I've had concerns about our maintenance procedures for months, but—" He hesitated. But reporting concerns wasn't encouraged within the organizational culture Vivian completed for him. That's precisely the type of structural problem the FAA needs to address. Diego nodded, relief evident in his expression. "There's something else you should know. After you reported the first panel issue, I checked our maintenance logs. The pre-flight inspection for this aircraft shows all panels were verified secure, but the signature doesn't match any of our actual maintenance personnel. It appears someone falsified the documentation. The information represented a potential criminal violation beyond standard regulatory non-compliance. Falsifying safety records carried significant legal penalties for both individuals and organizations." Vivian made careful note of the revelation, recognizing its implications for the broader investigation. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," she responded. "I'd appreciate if you could document what you found and your process for identifying the discrepancy. Whistleblower protections will apply to any information you provide." Diego's expression reflected both relief and resolve, the demeanor of someone finally able to address concerns that had troubled his professional conscience. "My father worked airport maintenance for 30 years after being denied his pilot credentials when we immigrated. He always said the system would only change when people inside were brave enough to speak up. I wish he could see this moment. The personal connection revealing how deeply the industry's discriminatory patterns had affected Diego's family added another dimension to the unfolding accountability. It wasn't just about one passenger's treatment or one aircraft's safety issues, but about long-standing institutional patterns that had marginalized voices and concerns from diverse perspectives. As Diego returned to his duties visibly unburdened by finally voicing his concerns to someone with authority to address them, Vivian continued toward her seat. Before she reached row 42, however, she was approached by Kimberly Foster, who had been observing the transformations throughout the cabin. Inspector Blackwell Kimberly said quietly, "I've been documenting similar treatment patterns across multiple SkyWave flights for the past several months. As both a frequent passenger and a corporate client representative, I've witnessed concerning disparities that suggest institutional rather than individual issues." Vivian regarded her with professional interest. "I'd be very interested in reviewing your documentation, Ms. Foster. Passenger experiences provide crucial context for our regulatory assessments. I'd be happy to share everything I've gathered." Kimberly confirmed, handing Vivian a business card. "And I should mention that my company currently maintains a corporate account with SkyWave, valued at approximately $12 million annually. That relationship will be under immediate review based on what I've witnessed today." The statement represented yet another expanding consequence from regulatory compliance to potential significant revenue loss, as corporate clients reconsidered their relationships with an airline demonstrating concerning operational and cultural issues. As Vivian finally returned to her economy seat, the atmosphere throughout the cabin had transformed entirely. The previously indifferent economy crew members now provided attentive service to all passengers. Safety procedures that had been rushed or overlooked earlier were now being followed with meticulous precision. The very hierarchy that had seemed so immutable during boarding had been fundamentally disrupted. Word of the inspector's presence had spread throughout the aircraft via whispered conversations and text messages. Passengers who had witnessed Vivian's earlier treatment now observed with satisfaction as the same crew members who had enforced her humiliation scrambled to demonstrate professional competence under regulatory scrutiny. "The universe delivers karma in the most perfect packages," an older black woman remarked to her seatmate just loudly enough for Vivian to hear. They picked the absolute wrong sister to mess with today. In first class, the corporate executives who had been accommodated at Vivian's expense were now experiencing a different kind of discomfort, the realization that their privileged treatment had directly contributed to a regulatory investigation that could potentially affect their own corporate positions. Their previously comfortable journey had transformed into an exercise in damage control as they frantically communicated with headquarters about the unfolding situation. Most telling was Melissa's approach to Vivian's economy seat, approximately 20 minutes before landing. "Inspector Blackwell," she began with carefully modulated professionalism, "Captain Reynolds has authorized me to offer you return to your original first-class seat for the remainder of our journey." The offer attempting to undo the earlier displacement, now that Vivian's authority had been established, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of both regulatory protocols and the inspector's purpose. It suggested they still viewed the situation primarily in terms of status and accommodation rather than compliance and safety. "That won't be necessary, Ms. Sanders," Vivian replied evenly. "My current location provides excellent visibility of overall cabin operations. However, I would appreciate if you could ensure the safety issues we've identified are properly communicated to ground maintenance personnel before our arrival." The response, professional rather than punitive, reflected Vivian's focus on systems improvement rather than personal vindication. Her purpose wasn't to reclaim status, but to ensure safety standards were properly maintained throughout the organization. As the aircraft began its descent into Atlanta, the ripple effects continued expanding beyond the immediate flight. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was engaged in tense communication with SkyWave Operations Management, who had been notified of the unfolding regulatory situation. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation now observed its resolution with varying degrees of satisfaction and vindication. Most significantly, throughout the organization, the message was rapidly spreading. A routine discriminatory practice had escalated into a full regulatory investigation, with potential implications for the entire airline. What might have remained an isolated incident of passenger mistreatment, the kind that typically resulted in nothing more than an apology email and modest compensation, had transformed into a comprehensive examination of SkyWave's entire operational culture. Social media platforms were exploding with content from the flight videos of the original confrontation, juxtaposed with images of the subsequent inspection and crew response. Mainstream media outlets had picked up the story, with aviation reporters already preparing analyses of the potential regulatory and business implications. Corporate communications teams were frantically drafting statements, while legal departments assessed potential liability exposures. "Your video just hit 1 million views," a passenger informed the college student who had been documenting the incident. "CNN is asking for permission to use it on air." For Vivian, the situation wasn't about personal satisfaction, but professional responsibility. Each documented violation, each identified safety concern, each procedural failure represented potential lives affected by an organizational culture that prioritized hierarchy over safety and status over regulations. The ripple effects weren't collateral damage, but necessary consequences of a system functioning as designed, identifying problems, establishing accountability, and ultimately creating safer air travel for everyone involved. As the aircraft's wheels touched down on Atlanta's runway, neither the crew nor corporate leadership yet realized the full extent of the transformation their airline was about to undergo. What had begun with 5 discriminatory words, "This seat isn't for you," would ultimately catalyze the most comprehensive operational overhaul in SkyWave's 20-year history. The right person in the wrong seat can change everything, Vivian observed quietly to herself as the landing gear deployed. It wasn't about vindication or retribution, but about the opportunity for necessary change that might ultimately save lives. In the same way it might have saved her brother Michael's, had similar accountability existed years earlier. The arrival process at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport deviated significantly from standard procedures. As SkyWave Flight 327 approached the gate, Vivian observed multiple ground personnel already assembled on the jet bridge, their formal attire and anxious expressions suggesting corporate management rather than routine operations staff. Through the aircraft windows, additional unusual elements were visible. 3 official FAA vehicles positioned near the arrival gate, their distinctive logos immediately recognizable to industry insiders. A cluster of individuals in suits holding tablets and clipboards, clearly prepared for immediate regulatory action. And most tellingly, several news vans with satellite uplinks positioned at the terminal periphery, suggesting the social media firestorm had already attracted mainstream media attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Reynolds announced as the aircraft doors were disarmed, "we've arrived at our gate in Atlanta. Please remain seated until the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off. Certain passengers will be deplaning first due to operational requirements." The announcement, using the same euphemistic language that had earlier justified Vivian's displacement, now served a different purpose, attempting to manage the unfolding situation by controlling the inspector's interaction with waiting management personnel. It represented another miscalculation in understanding federal regulatory protocols. Inspector Blackwell Melissa approached the economy section with forced professionalism. "SkyWave management representatives are waiting to speak with you at the gate. We've arranged for priority deplaning to facilitate this discussion." "Thank you, Ms. Sanders," Vivian replied evenly. "But FAA protocols require me to observe complete arrival procedures before engaging with airline management. I'll deplane with my assigned group according to standard procedures." The response, adhering to regulatory requirements rather than accepting special treatment, visibly unsettled Melissa, who had clearly been instructed to escort the inspector directly to waiting executives. It represented another fundamental misunderstanding of both Vivian's purpose and the inspection process itself. But the executives have specifically requested I understand their concern. Vivian interrupted professionally, but my current inspection remains active until all passengers have safely deplaned. I'll be available for discussion with management representatives after completing my regulatory responsibilities. The exchange illustrated the continuing disconnect between corporate priority systems and regulatory requirements, the same misalignment that had created the initial discriminatory incident. Even now, SkyWave's response focused on managing the situation rather than addressing the underlying issues that had created it. As standard deplaning procedures continued, Vivian remained in her economy seat, documenting the crew's arrival protocols with the same methodical attention she'd applied throughout the flight. Her position in the last row provided excellent visibility of the entire cabin, allowing her to observe both passenger treatment and procedural compliance across all sections. Nearby passengers, now aware of her identity, watched with evident interest as the inspector, who had earlier been forcibly relocated, now controlled the unfolding situation through quiet, professional authority. The power reversal wasn't executed with triumphalism, but rather with focused regulatory purpose, each observation, each documentation entry representing standard inspection protocols rather than personal vindication. "You know, I never believed in karma until today," remarked an elderly woman as she gathered her belongings. "But seeing how this all played out, that's some divine-level justice right there." When Vivian finally deplaned with the last economy group, she emerged into a jet bridge crowded with anxiously waiting executives. The assembled group, clearly hastily assembled from local management, projected a mixture of damage control urgency and corporate damage limitation. Inspector Blackwell, a middle-aged man in an immaculate suit, stepped forward. "I'm Richard Bennett, SkyWave's Regional Director of Operations. We understand there were some concerns during your flight today." "Mr. Bennett?" Vivian acknowledged professionally, "I've identified multiple regulatory violations requiring immediate attention, including critical safety issues, falsified maintenance documentation, and procedural non-compliance affecting passenger safety." The clinical assessment, delivered without emotion but with unmistakable regulatory authority, visibly unsettled the assembled executives. What they had perhaps hoped to manage as a customer service incident was being explicitly framed as a comprehensive regulatory matter with potential certification implications. "We take these concerns very seriously," Bennett assured her, gesturing toward a nearby conference room. "We've arranged a private space where we can discuss these matters in detail." "I appreciate that," Vivian responded, "but FAA protocols require me to complete my documentation and submit preliminary findings before engaging in management discussions. I'll be available in approximately 90 minutes after fulfilling these requirements." The response, prioritizing regulatory process over executive convenience, clearly frustrated Bennett, whose expression tightened noticeably. "Inspector, I assure you that SkyWave is committed to addressing any concerns immediately. Our CEO is already en route from headquarters to personally oversee our response." "I'm glad to hear that," Vivian replied evenly. "Comprehensive organizational response will be essential given the nature and extent of the identified violations. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to complete my preliminary documentation." As she moved past the assembled executives toward the terminal concourse, the dynamic was unmistakable to everyone observing. The federal inspector wouldn't be managed, appeased, or diverted from established regulatory protocols. The same authority structure that had earlier attempted to dismiss her as a passenger now found itself subject to her professional oversight. Outside the gate area, the situation's public dimension was becoming increasingly apparent. Passengers from Flight 327 were being approached by both journalists and social media influencers seeking first-hand accounts. Clips from the flight were already playing on terminal news screens with captions like, "Discrimination turns to investigation, FAA Inspector reveals identity after being forced to economy." Several media outlets had begun live streaming from the terminal, providing real-time updates on what was rapidly becoming a viral story of accountability and consequences. Inspector Blackwell called a reporter, hurrying toward her with a microphone extended. "Can you comment on what happened aboard Flight 327 today? I'm currently conducting an active inspection and cannot comment on ongoing regulatory matters." Vivian responded professionally. "The FAA will issue appropriate statements through official channels once preliminary findings have been processed." The response, adhering to established media protocols rather than engaging in personal narrative, reflected Vivian's continued focus on professional responsibilities rather than individual vindication. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, her approach remained methodical and process-oriented, prioritizing regulatory effectiveness over personal spotlight. In the main terminal area, Vivian found a quiet workspace to organize her documentation and submit her preliminary findings through secure FAA channels. The process was methodical and comprehensive, each violation categorized according to regulatory frameworks, each observation time-stamped and referenced to specific aircraft systems or crew actions. Her preliminary report identified 27 distinct regulatory violations ranging from critical safety issues, improperly secured oxygen systems, falsified maintenance records, to operational non-compliance, discriminatory passenger treatment, improper safety demonstration procedures to potential criminal violations, intentional falsification of federally mandated safety documentation. The findings triggered automatic notification protocols within the FAA system, alerting multiple regulatory divisions to potential issues requiring immediate attention. Within minutes, Vivian's secure tablet began receiving acknowledgments and action notifications as the agency's oversight mechanisms engaged in response to her documentation. Most significantly, her report included formal recommendation for immediate implementation of FAA Special Emphasis Inspection (SEI) protocols across SkyWave's entire operation, a comprehensive regulatory response typically reserved for situations indicating potential structural safety concerns. The recommendation would trigger deployment of additional inspectors across multiple airports, comprehensive review of all maintenance records, and potential operational restrictions pending verification of compliance status. For Vivian, this recommendation wasn't punitive but protective, focusing on ensuring passenger safety rather than punishing organizational misconduct. It reflected her professional commitment to regulatory effectiveness rather than personal vindication, prioritizing system improvement over individual consequences. As she completed this process, Vivian was approached by Kimberly Foster, who had been observing the unfolding situation from nearby. "That was quite something," Kimberly commented, nodding toward the jet bridge where executives remained huddled in tense discussion. "I've never seen corporate hierarchy disrupted quite so effectively. Regulatory oversight exists precisely to ensure that operational requirements supersede organizational hierarchies when necessary," Vivian explained professionally, particularly regarding safety matters affecting the traveling public. "I've been thinking about our earlier conversation," Kimberly continued, producing a tablet of her own. "I mentioned documenting similar patterns across multiple SkyWave flights. I've compiled everything here: dates, routes, crew names, specific incidents. It's been happening systematically, particularly on this route." The documentation Kimberly provided, representing months of careful observation across dozens of flights, transformed what might have been viewed as an isolated incident into evidence of institutional patterns. It provided crucial context for Vivian's findings, suggesting the violations observed weren't anomalies, but rather symptoms of deeper organizational issues. "This is extremely valuable," Vivian acknowledged, reviewing the detailed records. "Passenger documentation often provides essential context for our regulatory assessments. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement regarding your observations?" "Absolutely," Kimberly confirmed without hesitation. "And as I mentioned earlier, my company maintains significant corporate accounts with SkyWave. We'll be reviewing those relationships based on what I've witnessed today and the airline's response to these issues." Their conversation was interrupted by Diego Rodriguez, who approached cautiously after apparently waiting for an appropriate moment. "Inspector Blackwell," he began quietly. I've been thinking about what you said regarding whistleblower protections. There are other maintenance issues beyond what we identified today, patterns I've observed, but wasn't sure how to properly report. Diego's expression reflected the internal conflict of someone weighing career security against professional integrity. My father spent 30 years watching corners being cut, procedures being ignored. He always told me that someday I'd have to decide what kind of aviation professional I wanted to be. I think today is that day. The FAA takes whistleblower information very seriously, Vivian assured him, providing contact information for the agency's Protected Disclosure Program. Your observations could be crucial in identifying structural issues requiring regulatory intervention. As Diego nodded gratefully before returning to his crew duties, the expanding consequences continued, rippling outward. What had begun as discriminatory treatment of a single passenger was now triggering multi-level responses, regulatory investigation, corporate accountability, potential, business, relationship, reconsideration, and employee whistleblower actions. By the time Vivian finally met with SkyWave's hastily assembled response team 90 minutes later, the situation had evolved significantly. The conference room originally offered had been replaced with a much larger operational center. The regional management representatives had been joined by senior executives who had arrived via corporate jet. The atmosphere had transformed from damage control to crisis management. Inspector Blackwell, a distinguished gray-haired man, stepped forward. I'm Harold Montgomery, SkyWave's Chief Executive Officer. I want to personally assure you that we take these matters with the utmost seriousness. Mr. Montgomery, Vivian acknowledged professionally, I appreciate your prompt response. As I've detailed in my preliminary findings, the issues identified today suggest significant concerns regarding SkyWave's safety culture, operational protocols, and organizational priorities. Rather than attempting to minimize or manage the situation as the regional team had initially tried, Montgomery nodded gravely. We've reviewed your initial documentation and recognized the severity of the identified issues. I've already initiated a full operational stand-down for comprehensive safety verification across our entire fleet. The decision to voluntarily ground aircraft pending inspection rather than waiting for potential FAA enforcement action represented a significant acknowledgement of the seriousness of Vivian's findings. It suggested an organization beginning to recognize the full implications of what had been uncovered. That's a prudent first step, Vivian confirmed. Though comprehensive resolution will require addressing the underlying organizational culture that enabled these violations, particularly regarding the differential application of safety standards and procedural compliance based on cabin class or passenger status. The direct reference to the discriminatory treatment that had initiated the entire investigation clearly resonated with Montgomery, whose expression reflected genuine concern rather than mere corporate damage limitation. The treatment you experienced was completely unacceptable and contradicts our stated values. It's clear we have significant work to do in aligning our operational reality with our organizational principles. The acknowledgement focusing on structural issues rather than individual blame suggested potential for meaningful change beyond mere policy adjustments or personnel actions. It represented recognition that the problems identified weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of deeper organizational dysfunction. As the meeting continued, Vivian maintained her professional focus on regulatory requirements and compliance verification rather than personal vindication. Her methodical presentation of findings recommended corrective actions and compliance verification protocols established a framework for comprehensive organizational change rather than merely addressing the specific incidents that had triggered the investigation. By the time the meeting concluded 3 hours later, SkyWave had committed to a comprehensive safety and culture audit, independent verification of all maintenance records across their fleet, mandatory retraining for all customer-facing personnel, and revision of all policies regarding passenger treatment and accommodation. This isn't just about avoiding penalties, Vivian stated clearly as the meeting concluded. It's about building systems where safety and dignity aren't competing priorities, but essential interconnected elements of operational identity. When you discriminate in one area, you create vulnerability in all areas. The statement encapsulating the connection between discrimination and safety risk would later be quoted in aviation industry publications and training materials. But in this moment, it simply served as a clear articulation of the fundamental principle underlying the entire regulatory response that differential treatment created operational vulnerabilities extending far beyond customer satisfaction to potentially affect critical safety systems. As Vivian finally left the operational center to complete her formal documentation, she passed Captain Reynolds waiting anxiously in an adjacent hallway. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by the haunted expression of someone recognizing that a single day's actions might end a decades-long career. Their eyes met briefly his, reflecting the recognition that his earlier arrogance had directly contributed to potentially career-ending consequences, hers communicating not triumph but professional purpose. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear to everyone. Observing authority derived from position meant nothing without the integrity to exercise it properly. True power came not from titles or uniforms, but from principled application of professional responsibility, regardless of circumstances or personal consequences. What had landed wasn't just Flight 327, but accountability itself, the recognition that actions have consequences, regardless of who performs them or who experiences them. 48 hours after the emergency fleet grounding began, SkyWave Airlines initiated the most comprehensive organizational transformation in its 20-year history. The immediate actions focused not only on addressing the specific violations identified during Flight 327, but on fundamentally restructuring systems policies and cultural elements that had enabled those violations to occur. In the maintenance division, independent inspectors verified every aircraft in the fleet, a process requiring over 15,000 labor hours across 27 locations nationwide. The comprehensive inspection revealed similar safety issues in 34 aircraft, all of which remained grounded pending FAA-approved repairs. More concerning still was the pattern of documentation discrepancies identified across multiple maintenance stations, suggesting institutional problems rather than isolated oversights. We've implemented a new triple verification protocol for all safety-critical systems, explained SkyWave's newly appointed Chief Safety Officer during a press briefing. Every inspection now requires independent verification by 3 separate technicians with photographic documentation uploaded to a centralized database accessible to both our safety team and FAA inspectors. The protocol, significantly exceeding regulatory requirements, represented the airline's recognition that rebuilding trust required going beyond minimum compliance standards. It established verification systems that would be difficult to circumvent even under operational pressure, addressing the structural vulnerabilities that had allowed previous violations to occur. Simultaneously, SkyWave's Flight Operations Division underwent equally dramatic transformation. Captain Reynolds had been removed from flight duties pending investigation, while his entire chain of command underwent comprehensive review for potential pattern issues. The preliminary findings revealed concerning consistency in how certain types of passenger complaints had been handled, particularly those involving discrimination or status-based treatment. Reynolds now faced not just internal disciplinary proceedings but potential license review from the FAA based on documented safety violations and operational misconduct. His previously untouchable status had evaporated overnight, transforming him from commanding authority figure to cautionary example throughout the organization. We've implemented immediate changes to our command protocols, announced SkyWave's VP of Flight Operations. No captain can now unilaterally authorize passenger displacement without Operations Center verification of policy compliance. We've also revised our passenger rights documentation to explicitly prohibit displacement based on non-operational factors. The policy changes, distributed to all flight crews through emergency briefings, established clear boundaries around previously ambiguous practices. They created accountability mechanisms that would make discriminatory actions more difficult to justify or execute under the guise of operational necessity. In the Cabin Services Division, the transformation was equally significant. Melissa Sanders had been removed from lead flight attendant duties and reassigned to mandatory retraining, focusing specifically on equal treatment protocols and safety prioritization. The company stopped short of termination, instead using her case as an institutional learning opportunity, transforming individual misconduct into broader organizational improvement. "We've completely redesigned our service protocols," explained the VP of Customer Experience. "Every passenger now receives documented consistent service standards regardless of how they're dressed, how they purchased their ticket, or any factor other than their confirmed class of service. We've eliminated all discretionary elements that previously allowed for subjective treatment decisions. The revised protocols, implemented through mandatory all-staff training sessions, transformed previously unwritten practices into explicit verifiable standards. They created measurement systems that would identify and address discriminatory patterns before they could become normalized within the organizational culture." Most significantly, SkyWave established a new Passenger Dignity Standards initiative led by none other than Diego Rodriguez, the flight attendant who had attempted to intervene during Flight 327. His promotion from probationary crew member to program director represented the organization's recognition of ethical leadership, regardless of hierarchical position. Diego's new role integrated his personal background and professional expertise in unprecedented ways. His father's experiences as an immigrant aviation professional who had faced persistent discrimination provided crucial perspective on the institutional patterns that needed addressing. His frontline experience created practical credibility with operational personnel who might otherwise resist change initiatives perceived as merely corporate compliance exercises. "Our new standards establish non-negotiable baselines for passenger treatment across all cabins and routes," Diego explained during the internal announcement. "These aren't aspirational goals, but mandatory requirements with clear accountability mechanisms. Every employee now has both the authority and the responsibility to ensure consistent application of these standards, regardless of circumstances." The initiative developed with input from civil rights organizations, disability advocates, and diversity consultants created comprehensive guidelines for ensuring equitable treatment regardless of perceived status appearance or other non-operational factors. It established anonymous reporting systems that allowed both passengers and employees to identify potential violations without fear of retaliation. Harold Montgomery personally led the most visible immediate action, a public accountability session broadcast to all SkyWave employees worldwide. The CEO stood before cameras without notes or teleprompter, addressing not just what had happened, but why it mattered and how it would change. What occurred on Flight 327 wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of cultural issues we must address directly, he acknowledged with unflinching candor. "We've allowed operational efficiency to override ethical treatment. We've permitted unwritten hierarchies to determine passenger dignity. We've enabled systems where appearance and perceived status influenced service quality. That ends today." The directness of his acknowledgement, accepting institutional responsibility rather than attributing issues to individual employees, set the tone for the transformation effort. It established that the changes weren't merely performative responses to negative publicity, but fundamental reconsideration of organizational values and practices. Throughout these immediate actions, Vivian Blackwell remained actively involved in her capacity as FAA Inspector. Her approach wasn't punitive, but constructive, focusing on structural improvements rather than individual blame on sustainable systems rather than temporary adjustments. The FAA's primary concern is ensuring that the identified issues are addressed comprehensively rather than cosmetically, she explained during a regulatory briefing. "We're looking for verifiable changes to systems processes and cultural elements that created the conditions for these violations to occur." Her emphasis on comprehensive change, rather than narrow compliance, reflected the regulatory system functioning as designed, not merely identifying problems, but ensuring meaningful resolution that would prevent similar issues in the future. It represented oversight focused on improvement rather than punishment, on transformation rather than mere correction. Simultaneously, Kimberly Foster leveraged her position as a major corporate client to push for accountability from a business perspective. Her company maintained its suspension of new bookings with SkyWave while establishing clear criteria for potential relationship restoration. As a significant corporate client, we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to influence industry practices, Kimberly explained to her executive team. We're establishing measurable standards that SkyWave must meet before we resume our business relationship, not just policy changes, but verifiable cultural transformation demonstrated through consistent passenger experiences. The approach, focusing on measurable outcomes rather than promised changes, created powerful business incentives aligned with regulatory requirements. It established that discriminatory practices weren't merely compliance issues, but direct threats to revenue streams and corporate relationships. Perhaps most significantly, these immediate actions created space for previously silenced voices within the organization. Employees who had observed concerning patterns but feared reporting them now found structured channels for sharing their experiences and recommendations. We've received over 300 internal submissions through our anonymous reporting system in just the first week, noted SkyWave's newly appointed ethics officer. These reports aren't just highlighting problems, but offering valuable insights into potential solutions from the employees closest to our operations. The flood of internal information representing previously suppressed knowledge within the organization provided crucial context for the transformation effort. It revealed patterns, identified recurring issues, and suggested practical improvements that might otherwise have remained unaddressed. Throughout these immediate actions, the focus remained not on punishment but on improvement, not on assigning blame but on creating systems that would ensure consistent safety and dignity regardless of individual intentions or circumstances. The transformation wasn't merely about addressing what had happened on Flight 327, but about fundamentally reconsidering how SkyWave operated across its entire network. For Vivian Blackwell, these immediate actions represented exactly the kind of comprehensive response that justified her regulatory approach. As she reviewed the airline's implementation reports, she recognized that the transformation extended far beyond the specific violations she had documented, addressing root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. The immediate actions demonstrate appropriate recognition of the issue's scope and significance, she noted in her formal assessment. The critical factor now will be sustaining this commitment beyond the initial response phase and institutionalizing these changes throughout the organizational culture. Her assessment reflected both professional evaluation and personal hope that the discrimination she had experienced would ultimately catalyze meaningful change, benefiting countless future passengers who would never know the catalyst for their improved experience. It represented the regulatory system functioning not just as enforcement but as transformation enablement, creating conditions for improvement rather than merely punishing non-compliance. As the immediate action phase transitioned to longer-term implementation, SkyWave Airlines had fundamentally altered its operational trajectory. What had begun as discriminatory treatment of a passenger perceived as unimportant had catalyzed comprehensive reconsideration of how an entire organization functioned, from maintenance practices to passenger treatment to leadership accountability. The immediate actions weren't merely reactions to negative publicity or regulatory pressure, but the beginning of fundamental transformation of systems, policies, practices, and ultimately organizational culture. They represented not just what SkyWave was stopping, but what it was starting to become: an organization where safety and dignity weren't competing priorities, but essential interconnected elements of its operational identity. 6 months after Flight 327 landed in Atlanta, the transformation of SkyWave Airlines had progressed from immediate response to fundamental restructuring. The changes implemented during this period went far beyond addressing specific incidents to reshape the organization's entire operational philosophy, establishing new foundations for both safety compliance and passenger dignity. The most visible change came in the form of SkyWave's Passenger Dignity Standards Initiative, which had evolved from emergency response to comprehensive industry-leading program. Under Diego Rodriguez's leadership, the initiative established non-negotiable baselines for passenger treatment across all cabins and routes, with clear accountability mechanisms for ensuring consistent application. Our standards aren't about special treatment, but consistent dignity, Diego explained during an industry conference presentation. We've eliminated subjective service elements that previously allowed for discriminatory practices and established objective criteria that ensure every passenger receives respectful, appropriate treatment, regardless of appearance, background, or ticket purchase method. The initiative had transformed not just internal practices, but passenger-facing policies as well. SkyWave now provided explicit documentation of passenger rights with every booking, detailing specific protections against displacement service disparities or discriminatory treatment. These rights weren't presented as customer service aspirations, but as guaranteed standards with clear remediation processes if violations occurred. The critical innovation is our transparency regarding both standards and accountability, noted industry analyst Maria Johnson. SkyWave has transformed typically vague service promises into specific measurable commitments with defined consequences if they're not met. It's a fundamental shift in how airlines conceptualize their relationship with passengers. This transparency extended to SkyWave's revolutionary treatment tracking system, which monitored service consistency across demographic groups, booking classes, and individual routes. The system analyzed everything from upgrade, downgrade patterns to service response times, identifying potential disparities before they could become institutional practices. We can now detect potential discrimination patterns at a statistical level before they become problematic, explained SkyWave's chief data officer. If we see that certain passenger groups are experiencing different treatment outcomes, despite similar booking circumstances, the system flags these disparities for immediate investigation and resolution. The system, developed with input from civil rights organizations and equity consultants, established what the industry now called service equity metrics that went beyond traditional customer satisfaction measures to specifically address consistency and fairness across diverse passenger populations. Equally significant were the structural changes implemented throughout SkyWave's maintenance and safety operations. The triple verification protocol, initially established as an emergency measure, had evolved into the industry-leading transparent maintenance accountability system, which fundamentally transformed how safety procedures were documented and verified. We've eliminated the possibility of documentation manipulation through distributed verification requirements, explained SkyWave's chief safety officer. Every safety-critical procedure now requires independent confirmation from multiple authorized personnel with photographic documentation uploaded to a blockchain-based system that prevents retroactive alteration. The system, exceeding all regulatory requirements, established unprecedented transparency regarding maintenance practices with status dashboards available to both regulatory authorities and passengers themselves. SkyWave had transformed maintenance verification from internal paperwork to public accountability, fundamentally altering the relationship between the airline regulators and traveling public. What SkyWave has implemented isn't just better compliance, but a new operational philosophy, noted FAA Administrator Janet Wilson during a congressional hearing. They've established that safety verification isn't a regulatory burden, but a fundamental operational value visibly integrated throughout their systems. This philosophy extended to SkyWave's completely restructured crew training programs, which now explicitly connected safety practices with passenger dignity rather than treating them as separate domains. The new approach, developed with input from both aviation experts and civil rights advocates, established that consistent treatment wasn't merely a customer service issue, but a fundamental safety requirement. We've redesigned our entire training curriculum to eliminate the artificial separation between safety procedures and passenger treatment, explained SkyWave's VP of Training. Our crews now understand that selective application of procedures based on perceived passenger status creates not just equity issues but potential safety vulnerabilities that affect the entire aircraft. The integrated approach, teaching that differential treatment created operational risks rather than merely customer satisfaction issues, fundamentally altered how crew members conceptualized their responsibilities. It established that consistency wasn't just about fairness, but about operational integrity, linking ethical and safety considerations that had previously been treated as unrelated domains. Perhaps most significantly, SkyWave had completely restructured its accountability systems through the comprehensive reporting initiative that protected and encouraged internal identification of potential issues before they escalated to regulatory violations or passenger incidents. We've created multiple protected channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation, explained Harold Montgomery during a shareholder meeting. More importantly, we've established that using these channels isn't just permitted but expected of fundamental responsibility for every employee, regardless of position or seniority. The initiative, which had already processed over 2,000 internal submissions, transformed SkyWave's internal communication culture from hierarchical deference to collaborative improvement. It established that identifying potential issues wasn't insubordination, but essential contribution to organizational excellence, fundamentally altering how information flowed throughout the company. The critical innovation isn't just the reporting channels, but the response protocols, noted organizational psychologist Dr. James Chen. SkyWave has established that every report receives documented follow-up with transparent resolution tracking. They've transformed reporting from a risky individual action to a valued organizational process. These changes extended beyond SkyWave's internal operations to reshape its relationships with regulatory authorities, corporate clients, and the broader aviation industry. The airline had transformed from regulatory compliance target to collaborative improvement partner, working with the FAA to develop new standards that could potentially be applied across the entire industry. SkyWave has established new benchmarks for how airlines can work with regulatory authorities, noted Vivian Blackwell during an industry safety conference. They've transformed from minimum compliance to proactive partnership, sharing data insights and improvement methodologies that benefit not just their operations, but potentially the entire aviation ecosystem. This collaborative approach extended to SkyWave's relationships with corporate clients, particularly through the Corporate Account Transparency Initiative, developed in partnership with Kimberly Foster and other major business customers. The initiative established unprecedented visibility into service consistency across corporate accounts with regular statistical reporting on treatment patterns and potential disparities. We are providing our corporate clients with detailed analytics regarding how their employees are treated across our network, explained SkyWave's VP of Corporate Relations. This transparency creates accountability not just within our organization, but within the broader business travel ecosystem, establishing that consistent dignity is a measurable service element rather than a subjective experience. The initiative, now being adopted by other major carriers, transformed how corporate clients evaluated airline partnerships, establishing equity metrics alongside traditional factors like pricing and route coverage. It created market incentives for airlines to address discriminatory patterns, fundamentally altering the economic calculations around passenger treatment practices. Throughout these changes, SkyWave maintained unprecedented transparency regarding both challenges and progress. Monthly public updates detailed implementation status, ongoing issues, and lessons learned, transforming what might have been managed as a temporary PR crisis into an ongoing public commitment to continuous improvement. The remarkable aspect isn't just what they're doing, but how openly they're doing it, noted industry analyst Thomas Rodriguez. SkyWave has transformed potential reputation damage into differentiation advantage by publicly documenting their transformation journey, including both successes and continuing challenges. This transparency extended to SkyWave's financial reporting, which now explicitly connected passenger treatment standards with business performance metrics. The airline had established that dignity wasn't a cost center, but a value driver demonstrating measurable improvements in customer retention, corporate account growth, and employee satisfaction directly linked to their transformation initiatives. We've established that doing the right thing isn't just ethically necessary but financially beneficial, Montgomery explained during an investor call. Our data clearly shows that consistent dignity translates to improved retention, reduced complaints, more efficient operations, and ultimately stronger business performance across all key metrics. The connection supported by detailed analytics linking treatment consistency to business outcomes transformed how the organization conceptualized passenger dignity from customer service expense to strategic investment. It established that ethical treatment wasn't in tension with financial performance, but integral to sustainable business success, fundamentally altering traditional industry calculations. For Vivian Blackwell, these changes represented exactly the kind of comprehensive transformation she had hoped might emerge from the difficult experience of Flight 327. As she concluded her final compliance review 6 months after the incident, she recognized that the changes extended far beyond addressing specific violations to reshape how an entire organization functioned. The transformation SkyWave has implemented goes beyond regulatory compliance to establish new industry benchmarks for both safety practices and passenger treatment standards, she noted in her final assessment. They've demonstrated that comprehensive change is possible when organizations approach improvement as strategic opportunity rather than regulatory burden. Her assessment reflected both professional evaluation and personal satisfaction that her experience had ultimately catalyzed meaningful changes benefiting countless passengers who would never know the catalyst for their improved experience. It represented the regulatory system functioning not just as enforcement, but as improvement catalyst, creating conditions for transformation rather than merely punishing non-compliance. As SkyWave Airlines continued its transformation journey, the changes implemented weren't merely reactions to a specific incident, but fundamental reconsideration of the organization's operational identity. The airline had transformed from crisis response to industry leadership, establishing new standards that were already influencing practices throughout commercial aviation. The changes weren't just about what SkyWave had stopped doing, but what it had started to become an organization where safety and dignity weren't competing priorities, but essential interconnected elements of its operational philosophy. The transformation wasn't complete. Continuous improvement remained an ongoing commitment, but the fundamental trajectory had been permanently altered by what had begun as discriminatory treatment of a passenger perceived as unimportant. 1 year to the day after Flight 327 had departed JFK for Atlanta, Vivian Blackwell stood in a quiet corner of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The early morning light filtered through the massive windows, illuminating the historic aircraft suspended throughout the cavernous space. She wasn't there as an FAA inspector today, but as a sister, a daughter, a woman honoring personal connections that transcended professional responsibilities. In her hands, she held a small framed photograph her brother Michael at 24, smiling broadly beside the model airplane he'd built for his engineering project. His passion for aviation had inspired her own career, though neither of them could have imagined the circumstances that would ultimately connect his memory to her professional journey. "I think you'd be proud of what happened," she said quietly to the photograph. "Not because of what happened to me, but because of what changed afterward. Real changes that will keep people safer." The memorial plaque nearby read simply, "In memory of Michael Blackwell and the 155 passengers and crew of Flight 2103. May their legacy be found in the safety improvements that followed." The investigation into that crash 14 years earlier had identified falsified maintenance records and improperly secured oxygen systems among the contributing factors, the same violations Vivian had documented on Flight 327, potentially preventing another similar tragedy. The personal moment represented the emotional resolution that had been building throughout the year, the recognition that her professional work wasn't just about regulatory compliance, but about preventing others from experiencing the loss she had endured. Each safety improvement, each accountability measure, each cultural transformation element connected directly to the brother whose absence had shaped her life and career. As she placed the photograph back in her bag, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Diego Rodriguez approaching his SkyWave uniform replaced by business attire, reflecting his new role as director of the Passenger Dignity Standards Program. "I hoped I might find you here," he said warmly. Today seemed significant. "It is?" Vivian acknowledged with a small smile. "Though I didn't expect company. I hope I'm not intruding." Diego responded, his expression reflecting genuine concern. "I just wanted to share something with you personally, rather than through official channels." He handed her a bound report emblazoned with SkyWave's logo and the words, "1 year later, transformation progress and continuing commitments." The document, clearly prepared for broader distribution, represented the airline's public accountability regarding the changes implemented since Flight 327. "We've made real progress," Diego explained as Vivian examined the report. "Not just policy changes, but measurable improvements in both safety compliance and treatment consistency. The statistical analysis shows significant positive change across all key metrics." The report detailed impressive transformations: a 94% reduction in maintenance documentation discrepancies, a 78% decrease in passenger discrimination complaints, complete elimination of non-operational displacements, and implementation of all recommended accountability systems. The data told a compelling story of organizational transformation beyond mere damage control. "The numbers are encouraging," Vivian acknowledged professionally. "But what about the cultural elements? Those are typically more resistant to change." Diego nodded thoughtfully. "That's been the greater challenge. Changing forms and processes is relatively straightforward. Changing mindsets and assumptions takes longer. But we're seeing real movement there, too." He directed her attention to a section of the report detailing anonymous employee feedback, candid assessments from personnel throughout the organization regarding both progress and continuing challenges. The responses reflected genuine engagement rather than performative compliance, suggesting cultural shifts beyond surface-level adjustments. "What's been most meaningful to me personally," Diego continued, "is how this transformation has created space for people who genuinely care about doing the right thing. Before, those voices were often silenced by operational pressures or hierarchical dynamics. Now they're being elevated and empowered." His observation reflected the most significant aspect of the emotional resolution, the recognition that the incident hadn't just triggered punitive consequences, but created opportunities for positive leadership to emerge throughout the organization. It had revealed problems, but also illuminated potential solutions that might otherwise have remained unexplored. "I never wanted anyone to lose their position," Vivian noted thoughtfully. "That wasn't the point. The goal was always improvement, not punishment." "I know," Diego replied. "That's been clear throughout. And it's made a difference in how people have engaged with the changes. They understand this isn't about blame, but about building something better." As they continued discussing the transformation journey, Kimberly Foster joined them, having arranged to meet Diego regarding the corporate account transparency initiative they had developed together. Her presence completed the unexpected reunion of the 3 individuals whose interactions had ultimately catalyzed SkyWave's transformation. "I didn't expect to find both of you here," Kimberly remarked with pleasant surprise. "Though perhaps I should have. Today holds significance for all of us, doesn't it? The simple acknowledgement that their shared experience had created connections beyond professional roles reflected another dimension of the emotional resolution. What had begun as discriminatory treatment of a passenger had ultimately created relationships and collaborations that transcended the difficult circumstances of their origin. "I was just sharing our progress report with Inspector Blackwell Diego," explained, gesturing to the document Vivian still held. "Marking the anniversary with accountability rather than celebration. Appropriate." Kimberly nodded approvingly. "Though there is something worth celebrating in the changes that have occurred not just at SkyWave but throughout the industry." She explained how the standards they had developed together were now being implemented by 3 other major carriers, with industry associations considering them for potential adoption as voluntary certification requirements. What had begun as one airline's crisis response had evolved into potential industry-wide transformation regarding both safety practices and passenger treatment standards. "That's perhaps the most meaningful outcome," Vivian observed. "Not just addressing what happened on one flight, but creating frameworks that could prevent similar issues across entire systems." As their conversation continued, Harold Montgomery arrived, completing the unexpected gathering of the 4 individuals most central to SkyWave's transformation journey. The CEO had come to the museum for his own reasons, unaware that the others would be present. "This is quite the coincidence," he remarked, clearly surprised to find them together. Or perhaps not coincidence at all, but appropriate convergence. His presence not as corporate authority, but as fellow participant in a shared transformation journey reflected the final element of the emotional resolution. The hierarchy that had enabled the original discrimination had been fundamentally disrupted, replaced by collaborative engagement focused on continuous improvement rather than positional authority. "I came to deliver something personally," Montgomery explained, presenting Vivian with a small package, though I hadn't expected an audience for the gesture. Inside the package was a crystal plaque inscribed with simple words, "In recognition of courage that catalyzed transformation. With gratitude for difficult truths that ultimately created better paths forward." The gesture acknowledging both the difficulty of what had occurred and the value of the changes it had triggered represented genuine recognition rather than performative reconciliation. It reflected understanding that meaningful resolution didn't require erasing difficult experiences, but rather honoring their transformative potential. "This isn't about making peace with what happened," Montgomery clarified, recognizing potential misinterpretation. "The treatment you experienced was inexcusable, period. This is about acknowledging that your response to that treatment, your professionalism, your focus on improvement, rather than retribution, created opportunity for meaningful change that might otherwise never have occurred." His distinction separating the inexcusable incident from the valuable transformation it ultimately triggered reflected mature understanding of how accountability and improvement could coexist without one diminishing the other. It established that acknowledging positive outcomes didn't require minimizing negative experiences that had catalyzed them. As the 4 individuals continued their unexpected conversation among the historic aircraft, each representing different aspects of the transformation journey, the emotional resolution crystallized not as closure on difficult experiences, but as recognition of their ultimate meaning and impact. For Vivian, the resolution wasn't about personal vindication, but professional purpose, seeing how her difficult experience had ultimately created systems and standards that would protect countless passengers who would never know the catalyst for their improved treatment. It connected directly to her brother's memory, transforming personal loss into professional impact that honored his life through potentially life-saving improvements. For Diego, the resolution represented the opportunity to build something positive from challenging circumstances, to transform potential career risk into leadership opportunity that aligned his daily work with his personal values. It established that ethical stance could create professional advancement rather than limitation, fundamentally altering his understanding of organizational dynamics. For Kimberly, the resolution reflected the power of sustained advocacy rather than momentary intervention of using institutional influence to create lasting change rather than merely addressing isolated incidents. It demonstrated that business relationships could drive ethical improvements when properly leveraged, establishing new connections between commercial standards and human dignity. For Montgomery, the resolution manifested as organizational transformation beyond crisis management, the recognition that difficult revelations could ultimately strengthen rather than damage the institution he led. It established that accountability wasn't organizational weakness, but potential catalyst for improvement that could ultimately enhance rather than threaten business success. As they finally parted ways, each returning to their respective professional responsibilities, the emotional resolution remained not as concluded chapter, but as continuing journey, not as final closure, but as transformed understanding that would continue shaping their paths forward. For Vivian Blackwell especially, as she took one final look at the photograph of her brother before leaving the museum, the resolution manifested in the recognition that his memory lived not just in personal recollection, but in professional impact, in systems improved, in standards elevated, in lives potentially saved through changes catalyzed by her commitment to both regulatory responsibility and human dignity. The true resolution wasn't punishment or vindication, but transformation, not just of airline procedures or corporate policies, but of fundamental understandings regarding how organizations function, how leadership manifests, how accountability operates, and ultimately how human dignity connects to operational integrity across complex systems. What had begun with discriminatory words, "This seat isn't for you," had ultimately created new understanding of who belonged not just in premium airplane seats, but in leadership positions, in decision-making processes, in improvement initiatives that transcended hierarchical limitations to establish new possibilities for both aviation safety and human dignity throughout an entire industry. The emotional resolution wasn't an ending but a beginning, not closure on difficult experiences, but recognition of their transformative potential in creating better systems, better organizations, and ultimately better treatment for countless individuals who would benefit from changes they might never know had originated in one difficult flight, on one challenging day that had ultimately catalyzed meaningful transformation far beyond its immediate circumstances. If this story of accountability and transformation moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. Share this video with someone who needs to see that justice can prevail, especially when we least expect it. Has anyone ever underestimated you based on your appearance? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the person who appears to have the least power is exactly the one who can change everything.